If you hear someone whisper that silence is safer than attention, they have never lived next to a man like him. I learned that the hard way the moment I arrived in this neighborhood, believing I had finally found a place where I could disappear. My name is Emily Carter, and I moved here with nothing but a suitcase, a new address, and the desperate hope that nobody would ever look at me twice again. The house was small, quiet, and located at the end of a tree-lined street just outside Chicago, where mornings felt slower and nights felt distant from the chaos I had left behind. For the first 3 days I believed I had succeeded. No one knocked. No one asked questions. No one invaded the fragile peace I was trying to rebuild. Then on the 4th day, everything changed without warning. A moving truck appeared in the driveway next door. Black, polished, and too expensive for a neighborhood like this. I noticed it first through the kitchen window while holding a cup of coffee I suddenly could not finish. Workers moved efficiently, too disciplined for a simple residential move. And there was something unsettling about the lack of noise, as if even their presence had been designed to avoid disruption. I told myself it was none of my business. People move all the time. Neighbors change. Life continues. But something about this did not feel like life continuing. It felt like something positioning itself. Later that afternoon I saw him for the first time. He did not arrive with chaos or announcement. He simply appeared at the edge of the driveway next door, standing still as if he had already been there long before I noticed. Tall, composed, dressed in a dark tailored coat that did not belong to suburban simplicity. His presence was quiet, but it did not feel empty. It felt deliberate. I remember pausing behind my curtain, my hand frozen halfway between pulling it closed and letting it fall. Something in me told me not to be seen. Not yet. He did not look at my house directly, not even once, but I had the strange and uncomfortable feeling that he already knew it was there. That night, I locked every door in my house twice. I told myself it was paranoia, the kind that comes from too many bad memories and too little trust. I checked the windows, adjusted the locks, and tried to convince myself that the world outside my walls had no reason to cross into my space. But at exactly 2:14 a.m., I noticed the light on next door. Soft, controlled, constant. It did not flicker like normal household light. It remained steady, as if someone had decided darkness was not acceptable. I stood in my kitchen, barefoot on cold tile, staring through the window across the narrow distance between the two houses. The curtains next door were open just enough for me to see movement inside, but never enough to understand what I was seeing. And in that moment, I realized something that made my chest tighten without explanation. I was no longer alone. Not in the way I had planned. Not in the way I had survived. Because whatever had moved into the house next door was not just a neighbor. It was awareness with intention. And I had the sinking feeling that my quiet escape had already stopped being quiet the moment he chose that house. The next morning did not bring clarity. It brought confirmation. I woke up earlier than usual, not because I slept poorly, but because my mind refused to settle into anything resembling rest. The memory of the light next door, steady and unmoving at 2:14 a.m., lingered in a way that made ordinary silence feel incomplete. I stood in my kitchen again, this time without coffee, watching the same window I had watched the night before. Nothing about the house next door looked different in daylight. It appeared ordinary, almost carefully ordinary, as if it had been designed to remove suspicion rather than invite it. That thought alone made me uncomfortable. I told myself I was overreacting. New neighbors move in every day. People settle. Life resumes its predictable rhythm. But rhythm implies familiarity, and nothing about this felt familiar. Around mid-morning, I stepped outside for the first time since his arrival next door. The air was cool, carrying that early autumn sharpness typical of suburban Chicago mornings, where everything looks calm enough to convince you nothing unusual could exist beneath it. I walked slowly down my driveway, pretending to focus on nothing in particular, though every step felt aware of the house beside mine. The curtains there were open now. The driveway was clear. No visible movement. Yet the sense of presence remained, as if the space itself had already been occupied in a way that did not require physical confirmation. I stopped briefly near my mailbox, pretending to check it, though nothing inside mattered. That was when I noticed him again. Not suddenly. Not dramatically. Just there, as if he had always been part of the environment and I was only now adjusting to noticing it. He stood near the side entrance of his house, dressed the same way as before, composed, controlled, completely unaffected by the normal pace of the neighborhood. He was not doing anything that should have drawn attention, yet everything about him did. I quickly looked away, pretending to focus on the street, but I could feel it. Awareness. Not staring. Not pressure. Something quieter. Something worse. The feeling that attention had already been established without permission. I returned inside my house faster than I intended. Once the door closed, I leaned against it for a moment, trying to reset my thoughts. I told myself again that nothing had happened. No interaction. No exchange. No reason for concern. And yet my body reacted as if something had crossed an invisible boundary. By the afternoon, I noticed the second detail I could no longer ignore. Small changes. Subtle ones. A delivery truck I did not recognize arriving at his house. Security cameras installed at angles that felt too precise for a residential property. A gate system that had not existed the day before. None of it was openly alarming on its own, but together they created a pattern that felt intentional. As if the house next door was not simply being lived in but configured. That word stayed in my mind longer than I expected. Configured. It implied purpose, design, awareness of outcome. I stood by my kitchen window again that evening, watching as lights turned on next door in a sequence too smooth to feel accidental. One by one. No hesitation. No randomness. Just structure emerging in real time. I did not see him clearly, but I felt his presence in the way the house responded around him. And for the first time, a thought formed that I could not immediately dismiss. This was not about proximity. It was about placement. And whatever had moved in next door was not simply living beside me. It was establishing a boundary I had not agreed to, and somehow already found myself inside. By the third day, I began to understand that silence was no longer empty. It was structured. It had edges, timing, and direction. I could feel it every time I stepped outside my house, as if the neighborhood itself had adjusted to accommodate something I could not yet fully name. The house next door no longer felt like a simple residence. It felt like a fixed point in a system I was slowly becoming aware of without ever agreeing to enter it. I tried to maintain my routine. I went to the grocery store in the morning, drove back in the early afternoon, and avoided looking too long in the direction of his property. But avoidance, I quickly realized, does not erase awareness. It only sharpens it. On my way back from the store, I noticed something new. 2 black vehicles were parked along the curb near his house. Not blocking traffic. Not drawing attention in an obvious way, but positioned too precisely to feel casual. I slowed my car slightly as I passed, telling myself I was being irrational, but the pattern was becoming harder to dismiss. This was not random movement. This was arrangement. When I parked in my driveway and stepped out of the car, I felt it again. That same quiet pressure of awareness. Not fear exactly. Not curiosity either. Something in between, like my environment was no longer neutral. I carried the groceries inside, placing them on the kitchen counter without fully unpacking them. My attention kept drifting back to the window. I told myself not to look. That was the moment I first saw him clearly since the initial day. He was not standing in a way that demanded attention. He was simply outside, near the boundary between our properties, speaking to someone I could not fully see from my angle. His posture remained calm, controlled, almost indifferent. But the people around him moved differently. They responded quickly, efficiently, as if following instructions that did not need to be spoken loudly. I stepped back from the window immediately, my heartbeat slightly faster than I wanted to admit. I stood still in the center of my kitchen, trying to rationalize what I had seen. There was nothing illegal about people working outside a house. Nothing unusual about vehicles or conversations. And yet everything together created a structure I could not ignore. Later that evening, I heard the sound of movement outside again. Not loud. Not disruptive. Controlled. I did not approach the window this time. Instead, I stayed in the hallway listening. Footsteps. Doors closing. Low voices that carried no clear emotion. And beneath all of it, the same underlying feeling I had been trying to dismiss since the first night. That my surroundings were no longer operating independently of each other. At exactly 9:47 p.m., my porch light flickered on without me touching it. I stood frozen for a moment, staring at it through the side window. I was certain I had not turned it on. I checked the switch out of instinct even though I already knew the answer. It was still off. That was when I noticed the small envelope placed neatly near my front door. No knock. No announcement. Just presents. I hesitated before opening the door, every instinct telling me not to rush. When I finally stepped outside, there was no one visible in the immediate area. Only the quiet street, the dim glow of distant lights, and the envelope waiting as if it had always belonged there. I did not open it immediately. I brought it inside first, placed it on the kitchen counter, and stared at it for a long moment. The paper was simple, unmarked, but its placement carried intent. I finally opened it. Inside was a single card with a short message written in clean, precise handwriting. It did not contain a threat. It did not contain a demand. It contained something far more unsettling. A statement that confirmed awareness. It read, "Your environment is not unmanaged." I stood still in my kitchen, the words repeating in my mind longer than I expected, because for the first time since moving here, I understood that what I had been calling coincidence was not coincidence at all. It was design, and I was already inside it. The message on the card stayed in my mind longer than I expected. Your environment is not unmanaged. It was a simple sentence, yet it refused to behave like one. I read it again and again in my kitchen, standing under the same light that had once felt ordinary but now felt like part of a system I had not agreed to join. The words did not feel like a warning. They felt like confirmation of something already in motion. I set the card down on the counter, but even after releasing it, I could not escape the sense that it was still influencing the space around me. I tried to return to normal tasks. I unpacked groceries slowly, placed items into cabinets, and turned on the faucet just to hear a sound that belonged to me. But nothing felt fully independent anymore. Even small actions carried the awareness that they were happening inside a structure I could not see in full. At one point, I paused mid-movement, realizing I was listening too closely to the silence of my own house, as if expecting it to respond. That was when I decided to step outside again, not because I wanted to, but because staying inside felt like staying inside a thought that was no longer mine alone. The evening air was colder than before, carrying that early night stillness that makes every sound feel intentional. I stood on my porch for a moment, scanning the street. Everything appeared normal at first glance. Neighbors returning home, distant headlights, quiet trees moving slightly in the wind. But normal no longer meant neutral. I walked slowly toward the edge of my driveway, stopping just before the boundary line between my property and the house next door. His house looked unchanged on the surface. Lights were on, curtains partially drawn, no visible movement that should have drawn attention. And yet I felt it again. That quiet pressure of awareness, the same sensation I had been trying to define since he arrived. I did not see him immediately. Instead, I noticed a vehicle parked slightly farther down the street than before, positioned in a way that did not interrupt traffic but also did not feel incidental. Then I saw him. He was standing near the side entrance again, speaking briefly with someone who left almost immediately afterward. There was no raised voice, no visible conflict, only exchange and departure, like instructions being completed without interruption. I remained where I was, not moving forward, not retreating. I told myself I was only observing. But observation was no longer passive in this environment. Felt like participation. A few seconds later he turned his head slightly. Not directly toward me, not dramatically, but enough that I understood something important without it being spoken. Distance did not mean absence of awareness. I stepped back slowly, returning to my porch, trying to regulate my breathing in a way that made me feel in control again. Inside the house, I locked the door without thinking, then immediately checked it twice as if repetition could restore certainty. It did not. Later that night, I heard a soft notification sound from my phone. No caller ID. No visible source. Just a single message. It contained only one line. You are being adjusted to visibility. I sat down on the edge of my bed, reading it once, then again, not because I misunderstood it, but because I was trying to understand how something so simple could feel like it described my entire reality. Outside my window, the house next door remained lit in a steady, controlled pattern. And for the first time, I understood that what had moved in beside me was not just a person. It was a system that had already begun accounting for my existence in real time. The message did not leave my mind the entire next day. You are being adjusted to visibility. It was written so simply that it almost felt like it should not have carried any emotional weight, yet it stayed with me like something I could not fully put down. I found myself replaying it while doing ordinary things like making coffee, checking my phone, and sitting near the window without actually looking outside. Everything in my house felt slightly altered, not physically, but in the way I perceived it. As if I had become aware that my environment was no longer purely mine, even when nothing visible had changed. By late morning, I decided I could not remain inside all day. I needed confirmation that the world outside still functioned normally, that I was not interpreting everything through a lens that had been permanently altered. I drove into town, keeping my route simple and familiar. The streets of suburban Chicago looked unchanged, people moving through routines, traffic lights cycling in predictable patterns, stores opening on schedule. But even normalcy now felt fragile, as if I was observing it from a position slightly outside of it rather than within it. I stopped at a small cafe, ordering something I barely tasted. While sitting near the window, I noticed a man in a dark suit across the street speaking briefly on a phone call before walking away. It was a small moment, easily forgettable, but my attention locked onto it longer than necessary. Not because of what he did, but because of the same feeling I had begun to associate with the house next door. Presence without announcement. Structure without explanation. I left the cafe sooner than planned and returned home, trying to convince myself that I was overanalyzing everything. But when I pulled into my driveway, I noticed something that disrupted that attempt. A small, unfamiliar vehicle was parked a few houses down, positioned in a way that did not belong to any of my neighbors. I slowed my car slightly before continuing forward, telling myself again that I was imagining patterns where none existed. Inside my house, I checked every room out of habit now rather than fear. It was becoming routine, which was more unsettling than the fear itself. Later that afternoon, I heard a knock at my front door for the first time since moving in. It was not loud, not aggressive, just one precise knock. I stood still for a moment before approaching, every instinct telling me that whatever waited on the other side would not fit into my previous understanding of normal interaction. When I opened the door, there was no one visible immediately, only a sealed envelope placed neatly on the ground. I looked up briefly, scanning the empty porch and quiet street, before picking it up and stepping back inside. The envelope contained another simple card, similar in style to the first. No signature. No identification. Only one sentence. Proximity is now being acknowledged. I read it twice before placing it on the table, feeling a shift that I could not immediately describe. This was no longer about observation alone. It was about recognition. And recognition implied response. I turned toward the window again, and for the first time, I realized I was not just living next to something unknown. I was already inside its awareness loop, whether I had agreed to it or not. The word proximity continued to echo in my mind long after I placed the card on the table. It was not a threatening word on its own, yet the way it had been used made it feel like something structural rather than emotional. I spent most of the day moving through my house with a sense that every room had slightly changed its meaning. The walls looked the same, the furniture was unchanged, but my perception of ownership over the space no longer felt absolute. By evening, I had started noticing details I had ignored before. The way shadows from the house next door reached slightly further across my yard as the sun set. The way the street felt quieter than usual, not in absence of sound, but in the way sound seemed spaced with intention. I told myself I was imagining patterns because of stress, but even that explanation felt increasingly weak. Around dusk, I saw movement outside my kitchen window. Not direct, not confrontational, just enough to draw attention. A vehicle I had not seen before was parked near the end of the street again, this time closer than the previous one. I stood still behind the counter, watching without stepping forward. Nothing about the situation suggested immediate danger, yet everything about it suggested design. I finally stepped outside not because I felt brave, but because staying inside felt like surrendering to uncertainty. The air was cooler now, and the neighborhood lights were beginning to turn on one by one. I walked slowly toward my driveway and stopped halfway, noticing that the house next door was illuminated in a way that felt more deliberate than before. The lighting inside was not random. It was layered, balanced, and consistent, as if each room had been arranged for visibility rather than comfort. I could not see him immediately, but I felt the same awareness I had begun associating with his presence. It was not observation from a distance. It was something closer to shared awareness of position. Then I saw him. He was standing near the side entrance again, speaking briefly with someone who left within moments. The exchange was short, controlled, and quiet, but the timing of it felt precise, like a completed step in a process I was not fully part of but no longer separate from either. I remained where I was, unsure whether moving forward or backward would change anything about what I was beginning to understand. After the person left, he turned slightly, not directly toward me, but in a way that acknowledged my position without requiring confirmation. That small shift in orientation carried more weight than direct eye contact would have. It implied recognition without invitation. I stepped back slowly toward my house, closing the distance between myself and my own space, as if trying to reestablish boundaries that no longer felt stable. Inside, I locked the door, then checked it again, realizing I was no longer doing it for safety, but for reassurance that action still meant something. Later that night, I received another message on my phone. No number, no identification, only text. It read, "Adjustment is progressing as expected." I sat on the edge of my bed, reading it repeatedly, not because I did not understand it, but because I was trying to understand how something so clinical could feel so personal. When I finally looked up, I noticed the lights in the house next door dimming in sequence, as if even time there followed structure rather than chance. And for the first time, I understood that proximity was no longer physical distance. It was the gradual alignment of awareness between two spaces that were never meant to feel separate again. The message did not leave me this time. Adjustment is progressing as expected. I read it once, then again, but there was no longer any confusion to resolve. The words had stopped behaving like a mystery and started behaving like a confirmation of something I had already been living inside without fully naming it. That realization did not come with panic. It came with stillness. The kind of stillness that happens when your mind stops resisting information it can no longer logically dismiss. I sat in my bedroom for a long time that night without moving, listening to the quiet of my own house, and noticing for the first time how different silence felt when it was no longer neutral. It felt structured, almost like it had intervals. I eventually stood up and walked to the window. The house next door was lit again, but differently than before. Not brighter or darker, just arranged. Certain rooms were illuminated while others remained intentionally subdued, as if visibility itself had been calibrated, rather than simply switched on. I stood there for several minutes without realizing how long I had been watching. There was no visible movement inside, yet the sense of presence remained constant, as if the house was operating even when nothing was happening in a way I could see. That was when I understood something I had been avoiding thinking directly. Nothing about this situation was reactive anymore. It was continuous. The next morning I tried to resume normal routine again, but the word normal had begun to lose its definition in ways I could not ignore. I made coffee, checked my phone, reviewed emails that no longer felt urgent in comparison to everything else I was experiencing. Each action felt slightly displaced, as if my daily life was still functioning on an older version of understanding that no longer matched what I knew. When I stepped outside, the air felt the same, but my perception of distance had changed. The house next door no longer felt like a separate property. It felt like a reference point, a fixed coordinate I was now subconsciously orienting around. I walked slowly down my driveway and noticed something new. A small marker near the curb that had not been there before. It was subtle enough that most people would not notice it, but once I saw it I could not unsee it. It did not feel decorative or accidental. It felt placed. I did not approach it. I simply observed it from where I stood, feeling the growing discomfort of recognizing intentionality in places I had previously assumed were random. Later that afternoon I saw him again. Not in a dramatic way. Not in a way that disrupted anything. He was simply there, standing near the edge of his property, speaking briefly with someone before they left in a car I did not recognize. The interaction lasted less than a minute, but the precision of it made it feel longer. Everything about it appeared controlled down to timing rather than emotion. I remained on my porch, watching without moving closer, realizing that my position in relation to him had become a constant rather than a choice. After the person left, he turned slightly, not toward me directly, but enough that I understood the acknowledgement was not accidental. It was measured. That single moment carried more weight than any direct interaction would have, because it confirmed something I was no longer able to deny. I was being accounted for in real time, not as a threat, not as an obstacle, but as an element within a system that was actively maintaining awareness of its surroundings. That evening, another message arrived on my phone. No sender again. Only text. Visibility threshold is stabilizing. I stared at it for a long time, not because I did not understand the words, but because I was beginning to understand them too clearly. I finally set the phone down and looked out toward the house next door one more time. The lights were steady again, unchanged, but I no longer saw them as simple illumination. I saw them as indicators of structure continuing beyond my perception. And for the first time, I understood that proximity was no longer something that could be measured in steps or distance. It was becoming a condition I was gradually learning to exist within. The concept of visibility had stopped feeling theoretical by the time the next evening arrived. It was no longer something I was trying to understand intellectually. It had become something I was living inside of, like an invisible framework shaping how I moved, what I noticed, and what I could no longer ignore. I woke up earlier than usual without intending to, not because of discomfort, but because my mind no longer allowed extended rest in the same way it used to. It felt as if awareness itself had become a background process running continuously, even when I was not actively thinking about it. I sat on the edge of my bed for several minutes before standing, listening to the quiet of my house. The silence was still present, but it no longer felt empty. It felt monitored in a way that was difficult to explain without sounding irrational, yet increasingly impossible to dismiss as imagination. I eventually made my way to the kitchen, repeating small routines that used to feel automatic. Pouring water, checking the window, adjusting nothing in particular. But everything felt slightly misaligned, as if my sense of normal had shifted just enough that familiar actions no longer anchored me in the same way. When I looked outside, I noticed that the house next door had its curtains partially open again. The lighting inside was soft, consistent, and controlled, as if the entire interior environment had been designed for visibility rather than privacy. I stood there longer than I intended, studying it without moving closer. There was no visible activity, yet I felt no absence of presence. That distinction had become increasingly important. Absence suggested emptiness. What I was sensing felt like structured continuity. I finally stepped outside, not because I needed to confirm anything, but because remaining inside felt like avoiding something I already understood was ongoing. The air was cooler again, and the neighborhood was quiet in a way that felt deliberately maintained rather than naturally occurring. As I walked toward my driveway, I noticed that the small marker near the curb had changed position slightly. It was subtle, almost negligible, but once I noticed it, it became impossible to dismiss. It did not feel like an object left behind accidentally. It felt like a reference point that had been adjusted. I stopped walking, watching it from a distance, trying to determine whether I was interpreting normal variation as meaning. That uncertainty itself had become part of the experience. Later that day I saw him again. Not in a dramatic or intrusive way. He was simply present near the boundary of his property, speaking briefly with someone who arrived and left within a short interval. The interaction was efficient, almost minimal, yet carried a sense of completion that did not require explanation. I stayed where I was, observing without approaching, aware that even passive observation now felt like participation in a shared field of awareness I had not previously recognized. After the person left, there was a brief pause in his movement. Then for a moment, his attention shifted slightly in my direction. Not directly, not confrontationally, but with enough precision that I understood it was intentional acknowledgement rather than coincidence. It was not a gesture of invitation or warning. It was recognition of positioning. That distinction stayed with me longer than expected. I returned inside my house shortly after, closing the door behind me with more awareness than urgency. The action of locking it no longer felt like protection in the traditional sense. It felt like maintaining structure. That evening, another message arrived on my phone. No name, no source, Only text. Adjustment phase nearing stabilization. I read it once, then again, not because I doubted the words, but because I was trying to understand what stabilization would mean in a context where nothing had ever been fully unstable to begin with. I eventually set the phone down and looked out the window one final time. The house next door remained lit in its controlled pattern, unchanged and deliberate. And for the first time, I understood that what I had been calling proximity was no longer about physical closeness. It was about integration into a system that had already accounted for my presence long before I became aware of it. By the time the final message arrived, I no longer reacted to notifications the way I had at the beginning of this experience. The sound itself did not startle me anymore. It simply marked continuation. I sat in my living room when my phone lit up on the table, and I already knew before picking it up that it would not be an ordinary message. Nothing about the past several days had been ordinary in any meaningful sense. I opened it slowly, not because I was afraid, but because I had learned that speed no longer changed what the message contained. The text was shorter than the previous ones. It read, "Stabilization complete." I read it once, then again, and then I placed the phone face down on the table without breaking my focus on it. The word complete should have suggested an ending, but instead it felt like a transition point I had already been moved past without being informed. I stood up and walked toward the window as I had done so many times before, but this time something felt different in the absence of uncertainty. The house next door was illuminated as usual, but now the lighting felt less like observation and more like confirmation. I could no longer interpret it as preparation or adjustment. It felt finalized. I remained still for a long moment, realizing that my instinct to analyze every small detail had started to quiet itself naturally. Not because I had stopped caring, but because I had reached a limit of what could be meaningfully questioned without repeating the same conclusions. When I finally stepped outside, the air felt unchanged, yet my perception of it was not. I walked slowly toward the boundary between my property and his, stopping at the same point I had stopped at before, but this time without hesitation or internal resistance. The space between the houses no longer felt like distance. It felt like shared awareness of presence that did not require explanation. I did not see him immediately, but I no longer needed to see movement to understand that presence was active. It was simply there, as it had been established to be. A few seconds later, he appeared near the side entrance of his house. His posture was unchanged from every previous time I had observed him. Calm, controlled, present without urgency. There was no accompanying event, no additional figure, no signal that anything had shifted externally. Yet internally I understood that something had concluded. Not in the environment but in the structure that had been shaping how I experienced it. He looked in my direction briefly, not as a new action, but as a continuation of something already established. There was no communication in the traditional sense. No gesture. No invitation. No warning. Only acknowledgement of position. And in that moment, I understood that everything I had experienced since the first night had not been leading toward discovery, but toward normalization of awareness itself. I slowly stepped back toward my house, not out of fear, but out of recognition that movement no longer defined separation the way it once had. Inside, I left the door unlocked for several seconds longer than usual before finally closing it. Not because I needed protection, but because I was observing my own change in response. When I turned back toward the window one final time, the house next door remained lit in its controlled pattern, but it no longer felt like something observing me. It felt like something I had already been integrated into without resistance. And for the first time since moving here, I understood that proximity was not something that had increased or decreased over time. It had been recalibrating me from the beginning, until there was no longer a clear difference between where I ended and where the system around me began.